Jarrett. Hi, Jarrett.
Okay, we started this a little late, Jarrett. Sorry, you'll be fine. Just catch up. So, early Earth would likely have been really, really violent. Like I said, in the process of creating the Earth to begin with, you had lots of things that ran into each other to form that big mass as is. So, it's constantly being bombarded by asteroids, meteorites, and comets. So early Earth, remember the last time the significant impact of an asteroid hitting this planet occurred, what happened?
The dinosaurs were
The dinosaurs died. And that was like 1 million years ago. Over 1 million years ago. So this early Earth scenario, you have to imagine that that kind of occurrence, an asteroid hitting the planet, could have happened like every other day, constantly. So it's really, really violent. There's so much energy involved in this that Earth likely would have been molten, right? It would have been liquid. But as it started to cool, it would stratify into layers, and we know that the Earth has layers, right? We have that iron nickel core and then mantle and everything else going out. We've talked about that in other classes probably. But so it's stratified into layers. Some of these gases are going to be released from the core. I'm going to need another page here real quick, since I can't do it on the board anymore. Insert page. Blank page after current. So the gases that are going to be released as that cools off a little bit, you might have to help me out and read them off. Was it hydrogen gas? There's carbon monoxide. And there was nitrogen. That look on your notes? So sure. Those three gases would have come out initially to make our early atmosphere. But then actually those gases would combine and react with each other to form these others. And so a little bit of nitrogen and hydrogen can combine to make ammonia in the atmosphere. There is also methane. It says water vapor, I think, right?
Yeah, sure.
And it says carbon dioxide. So this is not necessarily in order. This is just what I can remember. Is that all of them? So early Earth, we're pretty sure this is what the atmosphere would look like. It'd have those gases in it. We don't have much of that hydrogen left because it's so light it would have escaped our atmosphere or gravity at some point or another. But we have a lot of this other stuff still. There's still 70% of our atmosphere that's nitrogen that's inert. Right? It doesn't really react, doesn't do anything. But what significant thing do you notice is not on this list?
Oxygen.
Yeah, so we kind of like that. But it doesn't exist yet in early Earth. But understand that oxygen is not necessarily important to all life. Some organisms are anaerobic and actually do not like oxygen. It's toxic to them. So oxygen, we'll talk about that later when oxygen formed, because that did play a huge role in evolution, obviously, because all those things that it was toxic to, they had a mass extinction, right? Whereas the aerobic organisms exploded at that time, as far as their adaptive radiation created a lot of new species all at once. But looking at those gases that I talked about that would be in the atmosphere, you still need to answer this question, and this is a whiteboard question, so go grab a marker if you didn't get one yet. What important substance to all life would not have existed in the right form until Earth cooled down and solidified? The hint here is it's not oxygen. We just talked about oxygen would not have been in that early atmosphere, but it hasn't been created yet, so we're not worried about that. Not all life needs oxygen. But the clue to this is it says that it didn't exist in the right form. So it's actually one of these things that's circled up here. It's just not in the right form yet. So that should be a fairly decent hint.
Got it.
So write something down on your whiteboard. Need to be more specific. Specific to what form?
Layers and then atmosphere. Got it, this one's.
What form? Okay, so a few of us have the answer, but we're not being specific enough. When I say that it's not in the right form, I might want to know what form it's in. So all of this would be there in early Earth. You got hydrogen, carbon monoxide, nitrogen, ammonia, methane, water, carbon dioxide. But one of those things, until it's in the right form, life isn't really going to be able to exist. Pretty confident?
Yep.
So I don't even have to draw a stick?
Nope.
Sounds good to me. Well, what thing, what form?
Well, on the whiteboard question it says until Earth has been cooled down or solidified. Well,
So what would change
or the
forms
water
as
is
Earth
going to be a
cools?
gas right now because when it gets cooled down, it condenses into the liquid itself.
Okay. So yes, it's a good answer. You can make fun of him if you're jealous, but had a good answer. Nothing wrong with it. So, be specific in your answer. I do want to know that it's liquid water specifically, right? Because water was already there. I want to know what wasn't there. Liquid water didn't exist until the Earth cooled down to at least 100 degrees Celsius, because that's the boiling point for water. It'd have to drop below that. It still would have been really hot, but as soon as it drops below 100 degrees Celsius, this could condense the atmosphere and you could have rain that essentially filled our entire oceans and lakes and rivers and streams. All of that water was in the atmosphere. It ends up on land at that point. So there was water vapor. We needed liquid water. Okay, so otherwise, another thing we need to talk about before we go on. Just insert another blank page, apparently. I don't know if you guys remember, but day one in class, we talked about life.
Yeah.
And we talked about the characteristics of life.
Yes.
Right, so in order for life to form, we have to understand what life is. So again, we're just kind of reviewing this. Does anybody remember any of those characteristics of life?
Oh, it has to be able to reproduce.
Things that all living things have in common. So that was one of them.
You need to write this down.
If you don't remember it, you might write it down. What else was there?
It has to function properly. Like it has to
Reproduce.
perform everyday functions.
You said that. Well, maybe, but we'll talk about that in a different context. Keep going. Keep brainstorming. I could probably.
It has
throw
to
that
respond to
as-
the
what was that?
environment.
Grow and change.
Yes. Jake had a good one.
It has to respond to the environment.
Adapt.
Respond.
It has to
Which
be-
actually includes adapting,
It
right?
has to have cells.
Energy.
Cells, and it uses energy. That's everything, I think.
Yeah.
So, the performing everyday functions, Clay, that'd probably fall under here, that metabolism that you do. You're using energy to do that, so that's just underlying to it. But we need cells. It's going to use energy doing those reactions, metabolism. You need to reproduce, which ultimately means that there needs to be some kind of genetic material. You need to grow and develop. We're not really going to worry about these things so much today, although that response is literally what we talk about when we're talking about evolution and adapting and evolving. I mean, it's not always just me kicking Jake and him saying, ow, right? It doesn't have to be a behavioral response. Sometimes it's just how it responds to its environment, what is good, what's bad, what's selected for. So these things specifically, though, we need to kind of worry about today. So that's mostly what we'll focus on. Anybody need some time, or you got these all written down?
1 second.
Okay, wait, no.
So just in case you need to remember those were day one, and hopefully they're still in your brain somewhere, but. Okay, so first hypothesis we have, organic molecule hypotheses. In order for a living thing to exist, you need organic molecules. And those were the ones we talked about in chapter 2. So we talked about carbohydrates, we talked about lipids, we talked about proteins, we talked about nucleic acids. Those are the 4 major categories of organic molecules that are really, really important for living things. That's what you're made of. Those are the things that react in order to give you energy, and you use energy to do those reactions with those things constantly. So as far as that using energy is concerned, we're going to need organic molecules to react first. So before there could have been life, there would have to be these molecules. We have actually, excuse me, we have actually created some of those simple organic molecules when simulating early Earth conditions. So those Miller-Urey experiments, they have basically an atmosphere with those gases we talked about. There's liquid water. There's lots of energy. They're, sending basically lightning bolts through that because obviously Earth would be very violent. There would have been a lot of weird weather at the time when it was so hot and that water's starting to cool and condense, but there'd be crazy storms at the time, you would think. So they're simulating this early Earth, and they made lots of those simple organic molecules like amino acids that you would need to link together to make a protein. So just at least one simple thing right there. Knowing that you could make those, you could assume, yeah, maybe we can make all those other things too. So as the result of this experiment, we have this stuff. Of life, but we don't really have life yet. Understand that too. They didn't make a living thing. No scientist has ever been able to recreate life in a lab, not without cheating and taking a cell from a living thing that was already there. No scientist has ever been able to create life out of nothing, and we think it'd be really, really difficult, and you'd be fighting extreme odds to be able to do that, period. There's a lot of time, and apparently it happened. So we have this stuff, those organic molecules, but we don't really have life yet. So understand that although we might have this stuff that would make up a life form, we really don't know how to take that stuff and put it together to make a life form yet. We just know that you could have had that stuff to begin with. This note is actually kind of weird. They actually found a meteorite in the 60s that contained amino acids. So a meteorite that came from somewhere else had amino acids on it. What could that mean?
Other life.
Life on other planets. But also, if that's how we got our original organic molecules, that could actually imply, and this is kind of conjecture too, obviously, but maybe we
Maybe we're the aliens.
are aliens. If that stuff came from another planet to begin with, then technically we're aliens living on this planet.
Nah, they're all aliens.
Now that's not necessarily realistic because we know that the odds of that too are pretty crazy. But we do know that if an asteroid was to hit our planet like it did when the dinosaurs died, if a rock was ejected that happened to have bacteria on it, bacteria can actually survive the harsh conditions of outer space. So if that rock magically landed on another planet with liquid water and all the other things it would need, you could actually have life
Like on the moon.
transferred from one planet to another. You can seed life from one planet to another. So it's possible they were alien. It's still pretty unlikely, but it's not that much more unlikely than just life spontaneously creating itself on this planet to begin with. So we don't know, but it's a remote possibility that we're actually aliens. So that's interesting to think about. So that last slide,
My name.
those first hypotheses, we're just trying to get the stuff of life, the materials that you need to build a living thing. This slide's about making that living thing itself. So that's when the cell comes into play. you need that cell, remember, because those reactions that are supposed to happen don't happen unless you get that stuff in sufficient quantities in a small enough space. So we need a cell, and the first cell might have been an iron sulfide bubble. So near hydrothermal vents, so basically an underwater volcano, these iron sulfide bubbles are formed that are really, really, really tiny. They're the same size as a cell. So they're tiny little things. If you can get that stuff we just talked about inside of one of those bubbles, you could actually make a living thing. You could start having metabolism reactions between those organic molecules occur. So this is our next step. We need the materials to make a cell, but we also have to get them inside of a cell, inside of this very small container. So the stuff, I'm just being generic, Clay. The stuff that we talked about on this slide, the organic molecules, if we can get that inside of an iron sulfide bubble, maybe those reactions could start happening that we need to happen. What we really don't understand is how we would have gotten from here to here. Because in order for it to be a real living thing, you would need those lipid membranes surrounding the cells so that it's not stuck at the bottom of the ocean. It can go anywhere, like you do, all over this planet. So, how to get from there to there, we have no idea. There's not very much information as to how that could happen. Right? There's really not that much evidence that the first cells were in iron sulfide bubbles. We don't know that. That's just a good guess because it's a tiny little structure that could have contained those molecules. So we need one of these iron sulfide bubbles to ultimately end up with a membrane surrounding it that could leave and go somewhere else. Kind of a big jump, and we don't have a clue how that happened. So again, that's how you could win a Nobel Prize. Figure that out. That'd be awesome.
I got it.
You get on that, Clay. Third problem, reproduction. We're gonna have some kind of genetic material. So there was a lot of arguing, and there still is, about what would have been the first genetic material. Keep forgetting that Mr. Pieper's not here, so I can't write on that board. But
Yeah.
you guys remember that?
Yep.
That was called the central dogma of biology. So DNA, RNA, proteins. Understand when we're talking about spontaneous generation of things, life forming out of nowhere, it's probably most logical, or let me ask you a question. What's more logical to come first? Something that's very complex or something that's very simple? Simple. So what's the most simple thing in that chain?
Proteins.
It's actually the protein. And we just talked about how we could make amino acids in those experiments. So just link a couple together, you got a protein. That's all you got to do. So proteins probably did come first. And then we're going to assume that you would actually work backwards in that evolution of a real living thing. You'd have to kind of reverse engineer what RNA would be and what DNA would be. You'd have to store that information, figure out a way to store that information, just kind of in reverse. So if we're going to guess which thing came first, RNA or DNA, which one are we going to guess?
RNA,
And why would we say that?
because it's simpler than DNA.
Because it's simpler. That's an easy answer, and that's true. So we're pretty sure that RNA would have come first, just because it's simpler, it's single-stranded, that it's not as big, it doesn't hold as much information all at once. But there's other evidence that supports that as well, because you actually have these ribosomes that we found. that are specific kinds of RNA molecules that can also act as enzymes. So they're kind of a hybrid between RNA and proteins, because enzymes are usually proteins, but this is an RNA molecule that can act like an enzyme. The other important part about that is those ribozymes are capable of replicating themselves, which is your reproduction problem, right? If they can replicate themselves, you have more genetic material for that new generation. That's an easy solution to a problem that was going to come up pretty soon after explaining that RNA comes first. How do they replicate RNA? Well, it can replicate itself. You don't need that. And then the last question down here. The last question down here is not actually a whiteboard question or anything, it's just an open-ended idea. So we don't know, again, just like we don't know a whole lot of this stuff, but we think it's possible that viruses could have come first, because a virus is a very simple organism. Did we call a virus a living thing before? Why not?
They're not cells.
They didn't have a membrane-bound cell. But if a virus did become enclosed in a cell, it's not a big jump to go from here to here. And then once you have bacteria, a very simple organism that is a cell, is a living thing, then you could become more and more complicated until you get to something like us. So we're just trying to make intuitive leaps here. And since viruses are really good at imitating living things, maybe they were the first living things. They became living things that we call bacteria once they were enclosed in cells. So that same thing that gives you a cold, gives you a flu, makes you sick, maybe that's what the original life was on this planet. It's still here. It's just
Maybe you better
very well
think.
put.
Man, I'm not just thank God. I don't think just put them. Whoa. Wow. You're drinking grease.